Welcome to Stranger Things in the 1980s. My name is Vince Locke. I am your host.
In this podcast, my guest and I take deep dives into the Upside Down, where we analyze each episode of the Netflix series, along with related movies and books, and examine them in the context of 1980s America. Today, Brian Stout is back again to talk about Rambo and Chapter 6, The Monster. Welcome back, strangers. This time I'm joined again by my friend Brian Stout, who's going to talk to us about Rambo, and that's going to lead into a discussion of Chapter 6, The Monster. So, Brian, tell us about Rambo. What is Rambo? Why was it important? And what are some of its long-term effects?
Oh my. Well, Rambo. It's funny because it became known as Rambo, but originally the first film in the series is actually just called First Blood.
First Blood, and the second movie was called Rambo, First Blood Part 2.
Exactly. And the first film is actually based on a novel that was fairly well regarded, as I understand. And it was meant to be taken seriously. It has a lot of action elements, but in the film, John Rambo, the character that Stallone plays in it, is a Vietnam veteran who finds himself being harassed by police in a town, and then there's it escalates from there, and he escapes and into the woods, and they're trying to catch him, and they wind up finding the colonel that he reported to in Vietnam to try to talk him down, basically.
So not only was he a Vietnam vet, but he was Special Forces.
Yeah, I guess we need to get into that too. He was he was like one of the elites. But I mean, that first film, even though everybody now thinks Rambo is basically code for like mindless mayhem at this point, but that first film is really certainly not the first, but definitely one of the more noteworthy movies to deal with veterans issues coming home from Vietnam. I mean, obviously there's the film Coming Home, which is great, got a lot of critical attention and awards, but this was actually First Blood was meant to be a legit film. Like the others kind of turn into these cartoonish,
and we did reference this last time, that there is a weird change in tone, especially between the first movie and the third movie. The second movie is kind of a blend of those two, but yeah, you're right, the first movie was meant to be a fairly serious, dramatic story about Vietnam vets abuse when they return home and PTSD.
It's been a minute since I've seen it, but I don't think they expressly call it PTSD, because I don't think
that term was in use at the time.
It was, but it's clear that that's part of what is making things hard for him in his adjustment.
Do you remember what year that came out, the first one?
I believe it is 1982.
That's what I'm thinking. It feels like it was 82.
Yeah, and then the second film came out in 85, I think. And I bet the third one was 88.
That feels right.
Probably. Yeah, I think it's important to note that unfortunately Rambo sort of evolved as the 80s did. It just got more and more excessive and more jingoistic, and just it became the film, as you mentioned, is actually about him trying to rescue soldiers that are still held prisoner.
So that first movie was a fairly small scale story. The second one was about him returning to Vietnam to find POWs. And the third movie
is, yeah.
It's set in Afghanistan, where basically he is the one-man army who destroys everything.
I honestly
in the name of America.
But outside of In the Name of America, I honestly cannot remember what the driving, like, what the igniting issue is in that film.
I'm not sure it really matters either.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably by design.
It's all about explosions and badass violence.
Exactly. But it's interesting though, because they like the performance kind of were, or like the box office performance of them really does kind of follow a bell curve. Like First Blood did well. Rambo was a massive hit. And then the second one went over budget, or the Rambo 3, pardon me, went over budget, flopped with the critics, did not make nearly as much money as they were hoping. I feel like it maybe broke even. And then we don't see Rambo again for a really long time. I think the next film came out I want to say it was probably close to 20 years later. I think it came out in like the 2005 or.
It feels more like 2007, although I'm not positive. But yeah, it's in the early 2000s or mid 2000s. Right?
Yeah. And in full disclosure, I have not seen the final one. My understanding
is Last Blood is what it's called.
Yeah, I think it's called Last Blood. That sounds right.
Yeah. How many movies are there in the franchise now? Seems like 4, 5, 6.
Fifth one. Or
there's at least 5.
Oh, Rambo, the fourth film, came out in 2008. Actually, Stallone directed it. It's a really gnarly movie. Like it's more like a grindhouse film. Like
I've heard
violence is super crazy. I got a real kick out of it because I just thought it was so over the top and ridiculous. I kind of enjoyed it. And I thought, well, if this is the end of it, then great. But then I guess he had to go to the well one more time. I mean, how old is Sylvester Stallone also? Is he closing in on 80? He's got to be. Let's see.
At least in the 70s.
So that would make him 76 years old? Is that right? Yeah.
Well, as of this year, yeah.
July 6th.
Okay.
All right.
Very close to
Sylvester
July
Stallone.
4th. Okay.
May you not make another Rocky or Rambo film, please. Leave it to Creed. Let's run with that. That seems to be working very well. Yeah. So Rambo.
Let's not forget the cartoon.
Oh, geez, Louise. Yeah, there's a whole other. I remember there were toys. We talk about like things that are marketed to children that probably.
Yes. It is so absurd.
Was there a cereal? I feel like there was a cereal too.
There could well be, or could well have been. I mean, there were so many licensed cereals based on like Mr. T and Star Wars and stuff like that. So there could very well have been like Rambo's.
Oh gosh, that'd be the best. Rambo's. I love it. Yes, at the end.
But yeah, these movies, it's a rated R franchise, hyper violence, especially as it goes on. And they tried to turn it into a kid-friendly cartoon in order to sell toys.
Well, as far as I can see, there's no cereal. However, there was Rambo Black Flak Bubblegum, which was black raspberry flavored, and it was like little flak pellets. I do remember eating that.
And kids were very aware of Rambo at the time. Rambo was a hero.
Yeah, like I said, I had the toys.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw the movie, but my parents often took me to the drive-in to see movies that they would not take me to the proper theater to see.
And it seems, at least back then, it was more acceptable to expose kids to action movies like that than some other content.
Yeah, I definitely lived in a house where violence was totally okay, sex not so much.
Yes, very much myself too.
But yeah, toys, I'm sure there were t-shirts, I would have presumed.
Oh, I'm sure. And I think the whole idea of the toys and the cartoon was to cash in on the popularity of G.I. Joe.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. G.I. Joe was big. Yeah, military toys were massive in the 80s. Just a lot of white men with guns blowing shit up, basically.
And not just, military, but specifically American.
Yeah.
Like G.I. Joe was a real American hero. That was the tagline.
Yeah, there was a lot of that, just kind of blending those together. I believe, and you might need to keep me honest on this, but I feel like Reagan had probably mentioned Sylvester Stallone or Rambo at some point in I feel like I remember that being a thing.
I'm sure he probably did. I mean, Reagan, of course, he was a Hollywood actor. He had been president of the Screen Actors Guild. He was a big film buff. So yep. I'm sure I know he was aware of Rambo and that whole franchise. I don't know if he was a fan or not, but probably. That jingoism that we associate with Rambo is very much a part of that administration as well.
I mean, the other I think we talked about Top Gun on another episode recently.
We mentioned that last time, yeah.
But that was another really big piece of the American militaristic entertainment juggernaut that was happening. And if I have my druthers, we'll talk about a non-American who also contributed significantly later on in the episode.
Okay.
Because I noticed some really interesting choices with some of the characters.
Okay.
In this episode later. But yeah, Rambo, oh boy.
So we know what Rambo was now. Mm-hmm. Why was Rambo so important? And what are some of the long-term pop culture influences or effects?
I mean, he was very important because Sylvester Stallone, obviously, at this point was a major star. Rocky and Rambo are the two iconic characters in his career.
Huge action hero in the 1980s, along with Schwarzenegger, and Bruce Willis becomes one.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that those three guys in particular would become such good friends and business partners.
So we got Planet Hollywood.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just about to say that I think probably the biggest thing of Rambo's legacy, I think, is that it's the blueprint for the action star that we now have all the time, that we still get. Like The Rock is probably the Rambo version 10 or whatever. But there's also a lot of Rands too. Like, this was the 80s. The direct-to-video market was major.
Yes, and we will talk about that later on, about the rise of VHS and
a lot of those companies just thrived on making knockoffs of what was popular at the theater. And so you see the rise of all these other action stars, to varying degrees of success.
Yes, which will get parodied in the 90s in multiple ways.
Oh, yeah.
So The Last Action Hero, and then Hot Shots and stuff like that. And then The Expendables.
Yeah, I know of them. I don't think I've seen them. I mean, I know the premise.
I've seen the first one. I think that's the only one I saw. And that was really enough for me because, total 80s throwbacks to 80s action movies with icons of 80s action movies.
Yeah. It's like
led by Stallone, of course.
Mixed with, the Dirty Dozen with all the action has-beens in the movies, right?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, and not just 80s action heroes, but also 90s action heroes.
Yeah,
like Jet Li and the Stathams.
And
So exactly. That influence has stuck, and it's become more sort of deconstructed now. If you look at contemporary action heroes, you have, say, the Jason Bourne archetype, which has influenced the James Bond stories now.
Yeah.
That sort of lone wolf action hero who's that one-man army, that you can trace that all the way back to Rambo.
Oh, one other thing that I just came to mind about the Rambo films is that I think it's also interesting how Stallone becomes increasingly impervious to any kind of damage, or he just becomes more and more invincible as the film goes on. Right. In the first movie, there's a lot of when he gets hurt, there's some really gnarly things that happen. Like I probably will never get the image of him trying to sew up his arm out of my mind in that first film. But he becomes more or less bulletproof by the time we get around to the third Rambo. And also, I mean, his muscles he becomes more and more roided out, I think.
And that's sort of ultra masculine identity, which is really absurd, but is so iconic, especially from that time period.
And you mentioned a minute ago how this was kind of a moment where there was this influenced a lot. And then I think was it this century, we've seen a lot more action stars who do get hurt. They're probably as smart as they are cunning or violent. You mentioned Bourne, those films. His survival is almost equally dependent on his ingenuity in a lot of those films. But Rambo seems to just succeed through sheer force of firepower most of the time. And he's this one person. He never works with anyone else.
That is true. There is a sort of plausibility behind the modern action hero, even when that hero is that one-man army, which that plausibility is completely lacking with the Rambo and the 80s action icons.
So do you feel in a way that we've just sort of leapfrogged to the next level with superheroes being our new action stars? And
I was just thinking that
because something that makes them impervious.
To some extent, I think there is quite a lot of that going on. I was just thinking of like Captain America and the Avengers, and how in many ways those draw on those tropes and those archetypes of the Rambos and the action films of the 80s.
Like Batman is the first one that comes to mind for me. Because if you take the whole, and I'm not nearly as well versed in the comics as I am the films, but you know, as the movies cycles progress, there's more emphasis on him being this highly trained, like one person operation that is able to basically do everything on his own.
And it's starting to become more deconstructed in more recent years. I don't know if you saw the most recent Batman film.
Yeah, I did.
And of course, part of it is to explain why he's not as powerful as he is in most people's minds, is because he's starting out early on in his career as a crime fighter in that particular movie.
Emo Batman, right?
There is that. That's the biggest problem I've had with like Superman in recent years, is he's so emo and so guilt-ridden about who and what he is.
I kind of wish that they would do, like, if you remember in Kill Bill Volume 2, that great speech that Bill does about Superman. Well, I wish they would make a movie where that is the premise, where he's mocking the rest of us because he knows he's way better than us, and he is rather than being like tortured over being impervious.
Right. And I think we're seeing that more in like the alternative superhero narrative. So if you look at like The Boys or Invincible and stuff like that. But anyway, we're going off topic now. So where do we see, or how do we see Rambo represented, or what's the connection between Rambo and Stranger Things?
Well, there's one really explicit scene in this episode where Lucas puts on it's either, is it a camouflage or an American flag?
It is a camouflage bandana.
Camouflage, I think, right?
Yes.
Camouflage bandana tied into like a headband. It shows him like packing all of his weapons, which is one of the iconic sequences in all of these movies where
he's gearing up
the firepower for the adventure. And you know,
and he makes the point he's going to do it on his own.
I was going to say, and right before all of this happened, he expressly got upset when he was supposed to make amends with Dustin and Mike, and he just like said, no way.
And it had been foreshadowed when the boys were going to go look for Will on their own, and they bring the different gear and resources. Of course, Dustin brings the snacks, and Lucas brings the binoculars and the combat knife, both of which he points out are from Vietnam. And we see him packing his backpack with those tools that he had brought originally. So yeah, that is very much the Rambo gearing up scene. I mean, almost shot for shot.
Yeah, and there's also, and I don't know if didn't know this before or not, or if they just did this intentionally in this particular sequence, but there's a massive American flag on the wall just off to the side of Lucas in his bedroom.
I did not notice that.
And I don't remember if that has always been there. Because they don't mention much about patriotism.
And that is true. You don't get explicit patriotism being expressed here. You do get sort of references to the commies and stuff like that in Vietnam. Yeah. And that's one thing I do want to mention for especially younger audiences. There is this tendency to view Vietnam as something which is like almost ancient history, right? It's something that happened a long time ago. Technically, it was in the last century. It's something that's on the same level as like the Civil War or World War II. But in the 1980s, it was very much in living memory.
Yeah, because it was a very fresh wound at that point.
Yeah, I mean, it officially did not end until 1975. And this is, of course, set in 1983. So it's only a few years after. So yeah, Vietnam is something for our generation And for the previous generation, it's something which is very much in living memory.
Yeah. And it's one of the, I think the other things maybe for younger folks to get to is just that this was really the only time at that point that we'd had a war that was unpopular.
Yes.
Every other conflict that America had been in up till then was something where everybody just got behind whatever was happening and went with it.
Yes.
And we've had these, I mean, any of the conflicts that they, the younger folks may have been alive for, there's always that spike of it within certain crowds, but there seems to be more ambivalence, I think, around a lot of the conflicts that we get into since then. So I think it's important to note those things too, because it does play into some of these elements that are part of the Rambo character, which is that people came back from, World War II and they were seen as heroes. People came back from Vietnam and
they got spit on.
Mileage may vary. Yeah. Some people spit on, some people were
baby killers.
Yeah. there was a lot of antagonism toward Vietnam veterans. And there are some really good films that deal with a lot of that stuff. If it's something you're into. I mentioned Coming Home, Oliver Stone's Born on the 4th of July.
Yeah, so I was just thinking of that.
With your boy Tom Cruise, and probably his best performance outside of Magnolia, in my opinion. And then I'm thinking of like Oliver Stone's Platoon is another one that is probably, it's not one of my favorites, but I know it's one that
it is a big one that is fairly well received critically.
Massive. And then Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket.
Yeah,
more surreal version of it, but probably one of the very best in my opinion. So I think it's important to know those things, to kind of think about this Rambo character, because it is kind of a blend of just like, when you think about those two things together, like this veteran who's traumatized and has probably been mistreated by people now that he's back and, is maybe have some conflicted feeling or share some conflicted feelings about things that he did while he was there. For him to morph into this like relentless killing machine without a second thought about the bad guys.
And Rambo too, he goes back to Vietnam basically to finish the war and to win the war for the U.S.
Yeah. And so it's kind of like this American like fantasy in some ways, right? Of this war that we did not win, that was very unpopular and controversial, but it's these films kind of in a way seem to like an attempt to reclaim that narrative, or sort of like boost us back to that old time, which was very much a Reagan thing to be like, remember the good old days,
right?
That sort of thing. And gosh, I'm sure it's interesting that we've never seen anybody pull that one off in recent years, right? Oh boy, I won't get into all that, but this character I think is really important in terms of pop culture to try to understand this decade.
Yes,
because of the way he transforms throughout the decade. It's interesting to note, at least for that fourth film, he doesn't change at all. He's still just as, I think he begins living in a Tibetan monastery, I think, if I remember correctly, or is that one of the ones that came out in the 80s? At one point, I know he was living in a Tibetan monastery in when they like find him in the beginning of one of them. But yeah, he's an important character to understand for the 80s. And I'm sure he had an influence on the kids.
Yes.
I mean, they'd seen the film or seen the movies and stuff.
And the phrase "first blood" is used twice in this episode.
Yeah.
You drew first blood, or Dustin says to Mike. And then Mike says that to Lucas. I drew first blood. Yeah.
And that's also one of the iconic lines in the first movie also.
Yes. They drew first blood.
They drew first blood. Yeah.
Okay, and that brings us into this episode, Chapter 6, The Monster. And as we talked about last time, the phrase "the monster" was a bit of foreshadowing, because I think it's Lucas who says to the other boys, how do we know that 11 is not the monster? So that raises the question, who is the monster?
Well, it's not 11.
And the episode ends with her saying, "I'm the monster," and Mike says, "No, you're not."
Yeah. Well, I don't know if you want to skip to that critical part of that. It's toward the end of this episode, I think, is where we learned something very vital, which is that when she was, that she more or less opened the portal, like her. Yeah. And so.
Yeah, let's go there.
Say that. Yeah.
And she says, "I'm the monster because I opened the gate."
Because I opened the gate, not because she's the Demogorgon. Yeah, so that's one of the last things that happens in this episode is this completed flashback that we've been seeing bits and pieces of throughout the episode of her. And then she visualizes the Demogorgon. This really cool stuff. All those sequences are great. And they recalled this really cool movie from last 10 years or so that Jonathan Glazer made called Under the Skin with Scarlett Johansson.
Scarlett Johansson, yes.
Yeah.
The sort of the limbo plane where she goes when she's spying on the Russians and when she encounters the Demogorgon is very visually reminiscent of that particular movie. Yes.
Yeah, I'm sure that was on purpose. It really struck for me. I really liked the way that was put together.
So obviously the Demogorgon is the titular monster here, but metaphorically, I think we get a few monsters.
Oh, most certainly in this episode. Jeez, there's Steve, for example. It's
right.
Awful. Yeah, he does something really terrible in this episode to Nancy, which is...
Well, let's talk about that.
Yeah.
What does he do?
So
and why is it so terrible?
Well, when this episode begins, it starts out with Steve going to Nancy because he thinks that she needs him.
Mm-hmm.
And they're listening to Corey Hart sung my
Sunglasses at Night,
which made me laugh out loud because it's such a corny song, but it was massive in that era.
It was. In fact, it came out in November of 1983, which is when this particular season is set.
Yeah, so it was blowing up right at that point. But I mean, it was perfect for Steve, Mr. Cool, driving at night. He did not have his sunglasses on, unfortunately, but it was absolutely believable that he would dig that song. And so he goes to Nancy's house.
And it is, if you listen to the lyrics, it does deal with issues of betrayal, right?
Yeah. So it's a nice bit of foreshadowing. It's got some layers. Perfect.
Surprisingly, or at least for this particular scene, it
context.
works really well. Yes.
Yeah, in this context, maybe not so much in the grand, the great American pop catalog of music, but it works perfectly in this show.
Yes, it does.
They're so good at their needle drops in this episode, in this show. He goes to Nancy's house and he discovers that Jonathan is already in the room with Nancy in her bedroom.
Spies on them through the window.
Spies on them through the window, which is something he took Jonathan to task for early in the season. So he's kind of like doing.
There is that role reversal.
Yeah, and they're sitting on the bed and their backs are to the window, so they don't realize he's there. Then of course he's infuriated, and so later in the episode, something calls Nancy's attention to the marquee at the movie theater, and it's showing All the Right Moves, which is the movie that they were going to try to go see.
Exactly, it was referenced in the previous episode. And Jonathan and Nancy are in the Army surplus store. Getting supplies for monster hunting, as they say.
Another cool Rambo.
Yes. And they're putting the supplies in Jonathan's car when some teenage boys drive by and say, "Hey, Nancy, looking forward to seeing your movie." And that leads her to the marquee of the theater that has been vandalized.
Yeah, it's been spray painted and it says, did you write it down?
It says All the Right Moves, starring Nancy the Slut Wheeler.
So, of course, she's horrified. I mean, we all are. What a terrible thing to do. And then she rounds the corner and sees these folks spray painting still. And lo and behold, there's Steve right there. And so that's when they have their confrontation and Jonathan fights Steve. So, yeah, it's an interesting...
Which this will be referenced in later seasons as well about how Steve constantly gets his ass kicked. This is the first time it happens. Yeah, Jonathan whips his ass
too. Yeah, Jonathan really does get him. And there's also another offhand reference to Jonathan's sexuality.
Yes,
in this fight as well.
Yeah, Steve says, "I just thought you were a queer."
Yeah, which unfortunately, if I had a nickel for every time a fight that I remember from grade school started with somebody attacking someone's sexual identity, I mean, I probably could pay my student loans off. But it was very much not cool and very much of the 80s.
Yes, very much so.
And yeah, so it's interesting that there's this flip of Jonathan and Steve. There's this role reversal there,
which plays into this recurring theme of duality we see so many times, where characters parallel each other. And this is another example. Other monsters.
Well, obviously the monster, and then we just mentioned Elle, saying, like, designating herself as the monster.
Yes. And Dr. Brenner, I think, is the big monster.
Yeah, obviously he's particularly evil in this episode.
He's like, very much.
I mean, as you know, he's definitely operating at like an 8 or 9, I think, in this episode, as opposed to, you know, his normal 6 or 7, I think. Just his creepy shepherding of Elle in the flashbacks is very disconcerting and unnerving, and it recalls a lot of other signposts that we've referred to before. Just,
yes,
you know, got some Firestarter vibes.
When Hopper and Joyce go to visit Terry Ives, Eleven's mother, we get a little bit of the history there and how Brenner was involved in basically stealing the child. Yeah,
that's one of the major developments in this, you know, when you put those pieces together in this episode.
And at the end, Brenner suits up with his enforcers. They're all grabbing their guns and everything and hopping in the vans to go get the kids. So another gearing up moment.
Yep, another gearing up moment. There is, it's interesting to me to use more Rambo-ese. When there's the fight between Lucas and Mike, Lucas specifically calls Elle a traitor.
Oh, yes.
I think it's interesting because that's, like, you know, in Vietnam terms, you know, that's probably one of the worst things you'd be called. And I think some people who, you know, burned their draft cards, decided through whatever means, moved away. There's a lot of resistance to the draft.
Yes.
And some people viewed those folks as traitors.
Absolutely.
Also, the other thing that jumped out at me I mentioned earlier that there was another 80s action icon who seemed to be kind of recalled in this episode, which I guess in the timeline it probably doesn't work if this is 1983. But Elle gave me a very Terminator vibe in some of those scenes where she's walking or where other people interact with her in this episode, where she seems kind of like foreign to them or off.
Okay.
They don't really know what to do with her, like when she's in the grocery store and they think she's, you know,
yes.
It reminded me of some of those early scenes in, like, the Terminator, where she's not given anything to them to work with, so they're just kind of like, I don't really know what to do with you. It doesn't work in the timeline, but it did jump out at me, and because we were talking about all this,
I get what you're saying.
Yeah.
I mean, we do definitely get Terminator references in the next 2 seasons, but yeah, I can see that happening.
I also noticed that Hopper was driving a Pinto, which is a very
that's actually Joyce's car. Yeah, the Pinto.
Yeah, which is a really infamous vehicle from the 80s. I don't know. Did you cover this already on another episode?
I haven't. No.
So the Pinto is really infamous for something that happened in the early 80s. There was actually, it's one of the most noteworthy and horrible instances of, like, corporate criminality in American history. There was the Ford Pinto, there was an issue, I believe it was had to do with the gas tank, if I remember correctly, was explosive. And Ford could have put a part in there that would have fixed it at a cost of, like, it was very minimal, like $2 or something like that. Even in 1980s money, $2, come on. But someone at Ford crunched the numbers and determined that it would be more cost effective to just roll the dice than to issue a recall. And consequently, lots of people lost their lives because the vehicles were exploding and stuff. I looked at the vehicle for a second. I thought, is that a Pinto? And then I paused it to make sure.
Yeah.
And sure enough, it really is.
And that, in fact, that gets featured at one point on the glove box. It says Pinto there.
That it's Joyce's car makes plenty of sense, given, you know, what we've already covered about there's
financial situation.
Yeah.
So going back to the monster again, obviously the Demogorgon is the literal monster here. I met a kid this week who had a Demogorgon action figure, which I thought was really cool. And in fact, I want one of those now. But he asked if it was a boy or a girl. And I said, I don't know. That's a good question. So let me ask you that. Is the Demogorgon male or female?
Well, first of all, I actually saw that toy at the store yesterday too, and I was very much fixated on it. It's like, ooh, Demogorgon toy. That's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I feel like it's probably female. That's my guess.
I think so too.
Because I think that those guys would be invested in things like the Alien and Aliens being female.
And I think, yeah, definitely the design of the Demogorgon is certainly drawn from the xenomorphs of the Aliens franchise.
Yeah, so that's what led me to that idea.
And looking at the sort of life cycle of the Demogorgon, at the end of the first season, you know, it's hinted at that it is parasitic, that it reproduces asexually by incubating its young in human hosts as slugs. And then in the second season, we see that the slugs grow into the Demodog form, which then matures into the Demogorgon form. So that is very reminiscent of the life cycle of the xenomorphs, again, in Aliens. And the xenomorphs are produced by the alien queen. So that's, I think that's a big clue or connection that the Demogorgon is female. I mean, ultimately, it doesn't matter. But I think that, you know, thematically, it's interesting because, again, going back to that idea of duality, we're meant to associate 11 with the Demogorgon as well.
Yeah, I think just the attention to detail of and the references to other shows, I just naturally went there because I thought clearly these guys are fans of most of the same movies that I love too. So I'm like, oh,
I mean, I never really thought about it before, but now that I am thinking about it, I'm like, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, that would be what I'd imagine.
Going back to some recurring themes, as we've talked about, there is that idea of duality being explored again between 11 and the Demogorgon, but also Steve and Jonathan. And the phrase, "I'm right here," is used in the beginning of this episode. Both Jonathan and Nancy say it as they're separated by the tree, because the episode begins with Nancy in the Upside Down, and they're yelling to each other, "I'm right here," which is what Will said to Joyce earlier on in the season. And for me, it recalled E.T., because E.T. ends with E.T. telling Elliot, "I'll be right here." Looking at some symbols and motifs, there is the Tom Cruise poster in Nancy's bedroom. Tom Cruise has been referenced a few times before, and we've seen that poster a few times before this season. In the immediately preceding episode, Steve says that people think he looks a bit like Tom Cruise. So we're meant to associate Steve and Tom Cruise. And in that particular scene, Steve is spying on Nancy and Jonathan, and the Tom Cruise poster is sort of spying on them as well. So we're meant, I think, to connect or associate Steve and Tom Cruise. And of course, All the Right Moves is referenced again. That is the movie that's playing at the movie house that is defaced by Steve. So I thought that,
and that's a peeping Tom in this episode.
Yes, he is.
Peeping Tom Cruise.
Yeah, so a lot of nice little connections and plot threads there. When Nancy reaches out through the tree to Jonathan, her hand comes out, and that classic horror movie trope of the hand coming out of the ground. For me, that recalled the Evil Dead poster that we've seen in Jonathan's room several times. Looking at some illusions, First Blood is mentioned. Lucas gearing up is very almost shot for shot recreation of Rambo. Stephen King gets mentioned here.
Oh yeah, that was in the sequence where they go to meet with, why is her name escaping me?
Terry Ives.
Yes, Terry. Terry's sister says, I know this isn't a direct quote, but basically the idea was like, this is like some real Stephen King shit.
Yeah.
And she's describing what happened to Terry. It's quite like what happens in Firestarter too.
Exactly. And I think she's saying that Terry was trying to tell people that her daughter had these special powers. And I think when the sister references Stephen King, she's referencing Carrie specifically because she's talking about telekinesis and stuff like that. Yeah. But there is a very strong Firestarter vibe especially with what happens to Terry.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, she explicitly references some LSD experiments that were in the sensory deprivation thing that Elle was in earlier in the episode. Yeah, what she described, like experiment wise, it sounded a little more like Firestarter, but the telekinesis is definitely a Carrie thing.
Yes. And I think there is a bit of a Carrie reference as well, going back to Nancy's hand coming out of the tree, because the original Carrie film ends with the hand coming out of the grave.
You know, there's another couple of other things. One other thing that reminds me of Stephen King is that confrontation with the boys have with the bullies.
Yes.
Stand By Me vibes.
Stand By Me. I that and It. I was getting It.
Yeah.
Too.
Oh yeah, certainly. Probably more so It than Stand By Me even. So there was that. And then in that scene also with Terry's sister, she keeps saying the same thing to them. She keeps saying, like, you two would have gotten along fine or something to that effect.
Right.
Hopper, which she says repeatedly.
Yes.
I think it sort of implies that she doesn't really buy what he's selling either. She just seems kind of like she doesn't buy her sister's story. She just is now got to take care of her.
You do get that sense, and I think it's explored a little bit more in the next season. But yeah, the idea that Terry Ives comes off as a conspiracy theorist, and that's kind of the vibe that Hopper's giving off too. And so, yeah, the sister says, yeah, you have gotten along really well.
Yeah. And then, of course, that's how a lot of people felt about Joyce at various other points in the episode too. So
yes,
they're all kind of being lumped together there.
And of course, Joyce is in a similar situation as Terry Ives, in that her child has been abducted, not through the same forces, but connected forces.
Yeah. Yeah, actually. Yeah. And the sister implies that she treats her sister treats Terry weirdly because Terry still maintains the room that the child was supposed to be in. And she even specifically references things like they know the baby didn't make it and stuff. She sort of, it does recall a lot some of the things that people also said about Will.
Yes.
Just like, well, he's gone. There's a body, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of that going on too. So there's some interesting parallel there, which makes a lot of sense.
Duality again. Well, yes.
Yeah.
And then the music, as we've identified, Corey Hart's Sunglasses at Night, which is used so well in this particular episode.
Yeah.
And there's also Dolly Parton's Bargain Store playing in the background when Jonathan and Nancy are shopping at the Army surplus store.
Yeah. Yeah, I was trying to figure out what I thought about that. Because Dolly's voice stuck out for me immediately. And I was really trying to listen to the lyrics carefully to figure out why this song. And I'm curious to know what you got on that.
The speaker of the song saying that she is like a bargain store and that she's got what you need, but it's well used. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
So the idea was that, she had been used and abused and is looking for love and is willing to give people what they need.
Yeah. So who's the bargain store? Is it Jonathan or Nancy?
That's the question here, I think.
I think if you asked me 5 minutes later, I'd say Nancy. But
yeah, that's the connection that I was making. That's the
implication. But yeah, I guess it sort of applies to both of them, because there's a follow-up to that when they're putting the stuff in the car, and she says something like, 2 weekends ago, I was hanging out with Barb at the mall, spending hours trying to decide on a shirt.
Trying to buy a new top that Steve would like. Yeah.
Yeah. And then now I'm throwing army supplies into
buying bear traps with Jonathan Byers.
Yeah, bear traps. That was it. And then he says, like, what's the weirder part about that? And she says, you. So I think she views him as the bargain store. And maybe Steve views her as the bargain store.
Yeah, that's a good way of looking at it.
Yeah. Or I guess he probably views her more as Jolene at this point.
Yeah, because Steve does not shop at the bargain store.
Yeah. Oh, definitely not. He's Tom Cruise all the way.
Absolutely.
He's probably a chess king or something. Yeah. Merry-go-round.
So those are the points that I made note of. Anything else that you saw or that you want to speak to?
There was something about this episode that gave me a distinct, like, Two Towers vibe. Or
Really?
even an Empire Strikes Back vibe. Everybody's split up. They're trying to do their own thing. They all feel like they've got the best path forward.
Mhm.
And they're all kind of like, nope, I'm doing my thing. You don't know what you're talking about. And then they start to kind of, it looks toward the end of this episode, they're starting to converge a little bit more.
Yes. And this was mentioned quite a while ago, like in the second, maybe third episode, that there are 3 parallel storylines happening here. So you have the boys with 11, you have Hopper and Joyce, and then you have Jonathan and Nancy. They have all got their specific quest lines, but they all start to converge. So yeah, like you said, this is a much more action-oriented episode than the previous one was. And you got some good action, I will say.
Yeah, there's a lot happening here. There's some good reveals. And
Steve got his ass kicked, which I think up to this point, most viewers wanted.
You're happy to see him get his ass kicked.
Yes.
Yeah.
And Jonathan standing up. That sort of underdog aspect is something which is very pleasing.
Yeah. Also very 80s for the guy to finally step up to the bully.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a very iconic 80s trope from the high school films.
And the bullies with the younger boys sort of getting what they deserve. Yep, that's satisfying. Okay, so yeah, I think we touched on all of the major ideas and issues with this particular episode. So, homework then. Next time, we're going to talk about MK Ultra and Firestarter. We'll talk more about this next time. Recently, there was a remake of Firestarter that was released in theaters, which I have not seen. So I've no idea as to the quality of it or how well it's used to the source material. But I will say that I'm not a big fan of remakes anyway, because I think if something is good enough to be remade, just stick with the original.
I used to think that. Now that I have kids who will not watch anything that's old whatsoever, and they broke my heart by not liking the Muppets.
Oh,
I've now come to the idea that I think kids or people want their own version of things. I didn't see the new one, but I haven't heard much good about it, unfortunately. I do really dig the original, though. It's a pretty well-made movie, I think.
It really is. And the story itself. Here's the thing about Stephen King. I really like him as a storyteller. I'm not a big fan of him as a writer because his prose does tend to be, I don't want to say bloated, but he tends to be much more verbose than I typically care for. But Firestarter is a very lean book and very lean story. Mm-hmm. So I really enjoyed this one.
And you get Drew Barrymore coming off of E.T.
Yes.
If that won't convince you to see it, I don't know what else to say to you.
So till next time, thank you for listening. Thanks to Brian for joining us again. And until next time, stay strange. Stranger Things in the 1980s is produced by Dread Pirate Productions. Cover art is by Sherry Archer. The theme music is Cobalt by Alex Bloxham, used under license from Filmstro. Send questions or topic suggestions to dreadpirateproductions@gmail.com.